really the discussion about the Shock Doctrine as a book is a kind of hook to kind of start a discussion about the impact of crisis on possibilities for resistance, on the movement, on the left, really how crises impact on society. And I think it's an important discussion first because we are actually in a situation here and now which is very much shaped by capitalist crisis, by economic crises and their ramifications. Immediately, we're obviously experiencing the start of what most people expect to be the biggest economic crisis in history. And more generally, I think that both the economics and the politics of the last decade or so has very much been affected by the great financial crash of 2007, 2008, and the way that played out in society. So just in general, I think this is a very important discussion. A second, I think it's very important because the experience of the last 40 years of often very successful, unfortunately, ruling class attacks, I think has had a very big impact on the left. And I think it's had a tendency to make people quite pessimistic and defensive in general. And in particular, I think it's led people to assume that capitalist crisis always leads to, or tends to lead to, victories and opportunities for the ruling class. And I think it's led to a kind of one-sided view of what crises do to societies. And Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, which she wrote, I think, in 2007, or which was published in 2007, is a very influential expression, very clear and also influential expression of this way of thinking, I think. There's a lot of material in the book. Lots of it is very interesting. But one of its central ideas is that crises are almost part of the ruling class's armory with which they use to kind of impose their interests on society. And as I say, I think the book has lots of strengths, and I don't want to get into the detail of an assessment of the book. Really, that's not the point here. But what I do want to say is that particular argument, that particular attitude, I think is a break from the way the revolutionary left has seen things in the past. I think it's an approach that can mean that the left fails to respond adequately to crisis, and that it can lead us to miss crucial opportunities. And I think both the book and the arguments in general, the discussion in general about crises, are very much hooked around interpretations of the crisis of the 1970s, which signaled it was the first major crisis after the Second World War. It signaled the end of the long boom, and it eventually gave rise to the neoliberal phase of capitalism. And so what I want to do in the talk really is just three things briefly. I want to touch on three things. First of all, I want to say a few things about the crisis of the 1970s. Second, I want to make some comments about the general Marxist approach to crisis. And then thirdly, I want to come on a little bit to the situation we're in today. So just to talk about the 1970s for a bit, the turn towards Thatcherite policies of privatization, the kind of attacks on working class living standards and financialization that has come to be called neoliberalism, it really did arise out of that first major post-war economic crisis in the early 1970s, if viewed in a slightly longer perspective. And that crisis, which really started in 1973, was a product both, really like all crises, it was a product of both long-term economic problems of profitability, deep problems in the way capitalism operates on the one hand, and on the other, various short-term issues, in particular, a sudden spike in the oil price that took place in 1973. And it resulted in inflation, it resulted in, very, very high levels of inflation historically in British terms, also unemployment. It was a big shock to Western societies that had been used over the last couple of decades, the previous couple of decades, to steadily increasing living standards and relative stability in economic terms. So it was a major event, a pivotal event really, and it led, ultimately it did lead to the strengthening of the right. And I wanted to say a couple of things about that. First of all, I think it's important that this was partly a product of the kind of political context in which the crisis hit Britain, or hit certainly in Britain, and in other parts of the world as well, partially. The crisis happened after it was during a Tory government, but it was after a few years of a Labour government, 1964 to 1970. And it crucially took place at the end of this long period since the late 40s or 50s, in which a social democratic model and kind of mixed capitalist economy with some state-run, some market-run sections of society had been dominant, both under Tory and under Labour governments. There was a kind of consensus. It was called Butzkelism, but there was a consensus about this kind of mixed Keynesian light, if you like, kind of society that had dominated. And its effects played out under the Labour government of 1970, the Labour governments, I should say, of 1974 to 1979, because the Labour government got elected in 74, and these effects from 1976 included massive cutbacks to welfare, a pay freeze, a policy of tight money. Basically, what we would now call austerity was implemented by a Labour government from 1976 onwards. And the fact that the crisis took place in the context of this kind of what was regarded anyway as being a Keynesian type economic model, and that it took place largely under a Labour government, meant the ruling class were able to paint the left and Keynesianism as the problem, and therefore to build some support for a turn, some kind of popular support for a turn towards the market in the later part of the decade under Thatcher. And Thatcher won the election in 1979. So there was a sense in which the context made that possible. The second point I want to make about the 70s and the crisis was that, looking back on it, and at the time, it was by no means inevitable that this was a crisis that would lead to a shift to the right, even given the points I've made about the context. In fact, the crisis really broke in 1973. The immediate effect in Britain was that it fed into the biggest wave of working class struggle in Britain since the 1920s. There'd been in 1972, there'd been huge strike waves with the miners and the dockers and various other groups of workers. After the crisis hit, there was a second miners' strike, which actually forced industry down to a 3-day week, really caused another crisis, in a kind of political, social crisis in Britain, and threw the ruling class off balance. And Edward Heath, the Tory Prime Minister at the time, went to the country in 1974 on the basis of saying, literally, his kind of election tag was, who runs the country, the government or the unions? And he lost that election, narrowly, but he lost that election. Labour won on really the most radical manifesto I think it's ever run on. So that was, so it wasn't the case that the left was immediately disorientated or that the unions were immediately pushed back. There was actually a huge radicalization, which obviously was a continuation of things that had happened since the 60s, and real potential and real desire for change, which was expressed in the Labour Party's victory in 1974. 2 victories actually it had in that year. So really the problem was that once in office, after a couple of years or after a year or so, the Labour Party started to accept the fiscal demands of the Bank of England and the IMF. It imposed cuts and a pay freeze, a very, very stringent pay freeze. And it actually did enact the kind of will of the British ruling class, effectively, to make working class people pay for the crisis. And unfortunately, significant sections of the left, even outside of Labour, not by no means not the revolutionary left, but there were sections of the left outside Labour, in the working class and so forth, that went along with the idea that you have to do this in a crisis situation. And so the result was the working class movement was very, very seriously disorientated and weakened. And even after this, there were still massive struggles. In 1979, another huge strike wave, which has become to be called the Winter of Discontent, and more struggles after Thatcher won the election in 1979. And really, you know, as people probably know, it was only after the miners were defeated in 1985 that the outcome that the Tories were going to be the power that dominated after the crisis was settled. And that was the longest mass strike in British history. And it was a strike, again, that actually could have won. Private papers show that Thatcher came close to resigning at least twice during the miners' strike because she was worried she'd been defeated. So really, that's my way of saying the idea that even this crisis, which took place in some ways, you could argue on unfavourable terms for the left, even this crisis, its outcome was by no means preordained. It was by no means inevitable. It was the other outcomes could easily have happened. And it's also true that you know, as I say, that, you know, actually there was a huge radicalization that was deepened by the crisis initially. So this history, I hope, gives me a chance to move on and talk a little bit about the kind of Marxist tradition of analysing crisis, because as Marx argued, economic crises are not aberrations in capitalism, nor are they things, by the way, that are manufactured deliberately by the ruling class. They are an inherent flaw, and they are caused by the interaction between capitalism's long-term contradictions and shorter-term cyclical fluctuations of various different kinds. And those are kind of specific to the particular crisis we're talking about. They lead to the destruction or write-off of huge amounts of capital in order to restore profitability. But as a result, clearly they lead to attacks on working people, and they cause immense dislocation and misery. Those things are given. But crucially, they also cause discontent, they can cause resistance, and they almost inevitably cause ructions and rows and often splits within the ruling class. At the same time, they tend to expose the kind of irrationality of the system, the fact that the system has these deep flaws that lead to these crises every 10 or 12 years, roughly, in the system. So for those reasons, as well as being moments of kind of anxiety for everyone in society, they are definitely, almost by definition, moments of weakness and vulnerability for the ruling class. And Marx and Engels wrote, for example, about the way in which the great revolutionary wave of 1848 was partly driven by the fact that you had a major capitalist crisis taking place at the time. And later on, Lenin argued in 1913 that famous quote, he said, "For a revolution to take place, it is usually insufficient for the lower classes not to want to live in the old way. It is also necessary that the upper classes should be unable to rule in the old way." And actually here, what he's talking about is precisely a crisis in society, a crisis which has exposed all sorts of things about it in different ways, but has created deep problems for the ruling class, which almost all crises do at one level or another. So for Lenin, really, you know, he almost took it for granted that it would be during a crisis in society that a revolution could happen, if it is going to happen. The last just general point I wanted to make about the kind of Marxist approach to crisis is addresses the question of whether resistance is inevitable or automatic. And I don't know if people managed to read the Trotsky piece on crisis, boom and revolution that we kind of sent out as one of the things that might be worth having a look at. But I do recommend it because I think it's very important. And his point in brief was that while crises certainly don't always generate resistance, they actually have very, very different impacts on society, on different strata in society. But their political and social impact, both during and immediately after the crisis, depends, he argues, on the longer term economic and political context in which they take place. And he says, there's a quote here which I hope can help. He says, "At issue here is not whether an improvement in the conjuncture is possible," and by this he means an improvement for the bosses. So he says, "At issue here is not whether an improvement in the conjuncture is possible." Of course it is, he's saying, but whether the fluctuations of the conjuncture are proceeding along an ascending or a descending curve, an ascending or a descending curve. This is the most important aspect of the whole question. In other words, you know, the likely impact, the likely way a crisis will play out depends on both the economic and political context in which it takes place. Is capitalism declining? Is it in poor health? What has been the balance of forces? What is the state of the ruling class? What is the state of the working class? These are the things that at least give some idea about how a crisis is liable to play out at any given time. And it seems to me, I want to bring it up to the, I mean, I've got a few minutes left. I just want to bring the discussion up to the present day, really, because it seems to me that in some ways, the situation we are faced with today is almost the opposite of that was experienced in the 1970s. The period running up to the crisis in the 1970s was one in which profits, as I've said, profits and standards of living rose steadily throughout, you know, over 2 or 2.5 decades. And that, you know, that sort of very much shaped the situation. That trend, that particular trend, has been reversed. If you think about the nature or the context of the crises in which we're facing now, they're taking place in the midst of the most naked capitalist class rule that we've had since the 1930s, in which living standards are being forced down, inequality is spiraling, the welfare state is being hammered. And meanwhile, the whole thing is being justified, insofar as it is being justified at all. It's being promoted in quite crudely free market terms. You know, we're told there's no alternative. We're told that the free market is the only game in town, and that's the game that has been running now for 3 or 4 decades. So, you know, there's not very much question about who's going to get the blame, in a certain sense, for the series of crises that we've experienced or we are experiencing now. At the same time, it's a period in which, you know, the period since, actually, broadly speaking, since Thatcher came to power in 1979 or a little bit before, this is a period in which profits, looking at things from the point of the ruling class, profit rates remain at historically low levels. This in turn, amongst other things, means that the crises as they happen are getting deeper, not shallower. The period after the Second World War was a period where there were fluctuations, but they were very shallow. And so, you know, for these reasons, after these decades, it's become clear that the turn towards neoliberal policies have failed for the ruling class, even in their own terms, certainly in the terms that they justify them. I mean, some people argue neoliberalism was never anything more than smash and grab, but actually I don't think that's right. I mean, I think there's a core sense that some capitalists have just seen it as that, but it's also been very much justified as, you know, a way of restoring profitability. It hasn't done that. It's failed to do that. So you know, crises are always a problem for the ruling class, but these crises, they expose a real failure in the whole phase of capitalist rule that we're experiencing. To make matters worse, I think the ruling class response to the last crisis, triggered by the financial crash in 2007 and 8, was really quite disastrous for them in terms of legitimacy, in terms of being able to kind of, you know, have some sort of plausibility as a responsible and successful ruling class. Because what they did, as you remember, is they bailed out the banks on a massive scale, which was saving the very institutions that triggered the crisis and breaking their own financial rules and, you know, dogma. It was followed by the period of austerity, which was an attempt, a fairly naked attempt, to force working people to pay the price for the massive bailouts to the banks. Now, that wasn't a great cocktail as far as I'm concerned. for the ruling class in terms of their image. And they got away with imposing austerity. But let's not forget that there were waves of resistance around the world of all sorts, including massive street demonstrations in lots of parts of the world, including in Britain, but also the rise of Corbynism, which I don't think you can, there's a number of things that explain the rise of Corbynism, but one of them I think is definitely the 2007-2008 crisis and the outcome of it. So that's important. And then coming up to, to the very more immediate present, still the economy is in the doldrums, despite 40 years of the neoliberal cure. It's still absolutely scraping along the bottom. We're now facing what people say, as I say, is likely to be the deepest crisis in British history, which is partly a product of coronavirus, but all the signs were that it was accumulating, that it was going to hit, there was going to be a serious crisis. We could see this at the end of 2019. And as a result of all these failures, I think the ruling class is very divided and in some disarray. Obviously, a Tory narrative about Brexit dominated the last election. Combined with vicious attacks on Corbyn, it was enough for the Tories to win. But even Brexit is, we have to see it as an aspect of the ruling class's crisis because they're deeply divided over it. And to be honest with you, the bulk of the ruling class don't want to go down that road anyway. So I think this is a very problematic moment for the ruling class for these reasons. The situation is polarized. Clearly it's possible at different times to get quite large numbers of people to blame minorities and to blame immigration for the problems. It's true that the level of working class struggle is relatively low. And it's true that the defeat of Corbyn was a serious blow. But, and this is very, very important to me, that underlying this, if you look at the polls, most of the time, the dominant questions remain ones about class. There was a very interesting survey in the Financial Times actually recently, which was a sort of popular survey that they reported on, which showed that about the kind of way in which COVID has changed people's political attitudes. And it showed that COVID has actually reinforced anger against the wealthy and against the corporations, according to them, amongst 90% of most But so that was just one poll. And the Financial Times said, basically what's happening in the West, and I'm quoting them, is a lurch to the left in terms of political attitudes as a result of coronavirus. But look at, go back to 2010, look at any of the studies of British social attitudes and various other academic research into popular opinion. There are mountains of studies that show since 2010, there has been growing distrust of mainstream institutions, a growing demand for redistribution of wealth, renationalisation, trade union rights, and so on and so forth. There are problems on, as I say, on questions of racism and so on, but overwhelmingly, this seems to me to be the underlying situation. So the longer term background to the current crisis, I think, is one of relentless attacks by a ruling class whose central project is failing. And I think this is very, very important for us to grasp, because I think if we don't understand the situation like this, we're liable to go off on wrong tangents. It's not to say that the crisis can't hit and be very demoralizing immediately, or that the bosses and various different employers don't try and use it opportunistically. Of course they will. There will be and are being all sorts of attempts to hire and to fire and rehire, to close plants, to make redundancies, and so on and so forth. But that's not that for me is not that happens in all crises. That's not the characteristic of the current moment. And it's not to say, of course, that what the left does doesn't matter. Absolutely not. One of the factors that Trotsky discusses when he talks about the context is, one of the things that matters is precisely whether the left is battle ready, whether the left is organised and confident. And in a way, this is really the point. This is the point I want to end on, because it seems to me the approach the left takes to the crisis is going to be crucial. We can start from the fatalistic assumption that crises lead to, bosses' attacks and defeats, and we can hide away or follow Keir Starmer's kind of stampede to the centre, or we can understand a crisis as an opening that needs to be fought over. And, clearly that's the way I would I would argue the left needs to approach this thing. It means recognizing that every struggle that takes place is happening in a context in which the ruling class is divided and weak, and in which there is a widespread sense that this crisis is a crisis caused by the elites. You know, every element of the ruling class, actually, if you look at the opinion polls, has a very, very low level of trust. The politicians, state institutions, big business, all three core elements of the ruling class are, you know, in the doghouse in popular terms. And so that means that every struggle is politically charged. And you can see this very, very concretely in what's been happening during the coronavirus crisis, which has only obviously deepened the ruling class's problems. Time after time, resistance, however limited, whether it's over trying to get schools closed back in the summer or the spring, whether it's over free school meals, whether it's over ending the furlough, and so on, that every time there's been resistance, it's had massive popular support. You know, Marcus Rashford is a popular hero, you know, and very often when there has been a kickback against Tory policies, the government has U-turned. This government will be known as the government that U-turned time after time under popular pressure. And that should be to me, that kind of reinforces the point I'm making. There hasn't been a huge amount of resistance, but when there has been resistance, it's had a massive impact. It's had a real, all resistance will be very, very politically charged in the current period. And so to end, I mean, I just think it's very, very important that we break from the idea that, you know, or that we reject the idea that this crisis or any other crisis is simply an opportunity for the ruling class to make hay. It seems to me that's very, very wrong-headed. Of course, the outcome of the current crisis is not preordained, but it seems to me there almost inevitably will be more struggles along the lines of struggles we've seen, and probably bigger ones. And it also seems to me that a left that supports them, that links them, that generalizes them in a confident way and tries to push back against them really does have a chance of overcoming the setback of Corbynism and turning this movement once again to this moment once again to our advantage. I'll end there.